The first thing Commander Ren Vasquez noticed about the Velthara delegation hall was that it smelled like rain before it falls. That electric, heavy pressure that makes your sinuses tingle and your instincts whisper something is coming. The second thing she noticed was that every single alien in the room had stopped talking the moment she walked through the door. Not the polite pause of a crowd registering a newcomer, the sharp, collective silence of people seeing something unexpected. She kept walking. 6 months on Velthara Station had taught her that hesitation read as weakness in Velthari body language. Their species communicated confidence through momentum. You moved like you belonged somewhere, or you admitted you didn't. Ren belonged everywhere. That was, professionally speaking, her entire skill set. The delegation hall was a masterpiece of organic architecture. Walls grown from something between stone and living coral, soft amber light filtering through membranes that pulsed gently like breathing. Long tables curved in concentric semicircles, facing a central platform where the negotiations would eventually happen. Eventually being the operative word, because right now approximately 40 Velthari dignitaries were staring at her with those luminous silver eyes and the peculiar ear fan structures along their jawlines fully extended, which Ren had learned meant heightened attention or alarm, depending on context. She was used to the staring. Humans always got stared at. What she wasn't used to was the laughter that followed. It started with one of the junior delegates near the back, a sound like crystal wind chimes, melodic and sharp. Then it spread, rippling through the assembled Velthari with the unstoppable momentum of a very elegant wave. Not cruel laughter exactly, more the laughter of people who had just seen something they found genuinely, deeply absurd. Ren stopped walking. She set her case down on the nearest table. She waited. The source of the amusement became clear 30 seconds later, when the Velthari delegate directly across from her, tall, silver-skinned, with the kind of bone structure that suggested her species had simply decided to be beautiful as a matter of policy, gestured toward Ren's chest with one long, graceful finger. "Your armor," the delegate said, in precise, slightly formal standard. "It is a toy, yes?" The ear fans along her jaw angled forward in what Ren had catalogued as amused curiosity. Several nearby delegates made similar expressions, their silver eyes bright with the particular delight of someone who has found an unexpected source of entertainment at what was supposed to be a tedious diplomatic function. Ren looked down at her combat-rated exosuit, matte black polymer ceramic composite, rated for vacuum exposure, extreme temperature differentials from -180 to +400 Celsius, ballistic resistance up to level 7, integrated medical monitoring, emergency oxygen for 6 hours, and enough structural reinforcement to let her survive falls that would turn an unprotected human body into something that required a very small container for transport. She'd been wearing variants of this suit for 11 years. It had saved her life on 4 separate occasions, 3 of which she didn't particularly enjoy thinking about. "I'm sorry," she said. "The material." The delegate stepped closer, tilting her head with that fluid Velthari grace that made even idle movement look choreographed. "It is so thin. And the joints, they flex, yes? Our warriors wear plate grown from living stone, 7 centimeters thick at minimum. What you wear would not stop a training blade used by our youngest students." The amusement in her voice was genuine, not malicious, which somehow made it worse. "I mean no insult. It is simply small, fragile, like something made for a child who wishes to play at battle." The laughter in the room had softened but not stopped. Ren registered 23 separate ear fan expressions of entertained agreement from her peripheral vision. She'd been the source of diplomatic awkwardness before. She'd accidentally insulted a Cathara elder by complimenting his molt pattern once. She'd shaken hands with a Durathi ambassador using the wrong limb, causing a minor incident that took 3 weeks to resolve. She was familiar with being the human in the room who had done something culturally wrong. This was different. This wasn't cultural misunderstanding. This was the Velthari delegate looking at her protection and finding it funny. Ren picked her case back up. She considered her response with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned that the first words spoken in a room tend to echo longest. "You're right," she said. "It's thin." The delegate's ear fans tilted, registering the non-defensive response as unexpected. "You agree?" "I agree it's thin. Your observation is accurate." Ren met those silver eyes directly. "Though I'd push back gently on the word fragile. You would survive a blow from our training blades in this?" Genuine curiosity now, the amusement shading into something more interested. "Probably not without consequences," Ren said honestly. "But consequences and defeat are different things. My species learned that distinction a long time ago." She said it without heat, without the edge that would have made it a challenge, just a statement of fact, the way you might note a difference in atmospheric pressure. Relevant information, clinically delivered. The delegate's ear fans shifted again, a subtle repositioning that Ren couldn't yet read with confidence. The laughter in the room had gone quiet. "I am Delegate Sova," the tall alien said after a moment, "senior voice for the Velthara Accord Council. Commander Ren Vasquez, Earth Coalition Infrastructure and Diplomatic Corps." "Infrastructure," Sova repeated, as though testing the word. "They sent an infrastructure officer to negotiate territorial rights in the Kerath Expanse?" "They sent the person most likely to get something built after the talking stops," Ren said. "The talking is usually easier when someone in the room knows what comes next." Sova studied her with an expression that Ren couldn't fully catalogue yet, new to her growing mental library of Velthari tells. It wasn't amusement anymore, it wasn't dismissal, it was the particular quality of attention that highly intelligent beings direct toward things that have surprised them once and might surprise them again. "Interesting," Sova said finally. "The armor question," Ren said almost as an afterthought, setting her case on the table and opening the first clasps. "I'll answer it properly, just not here and not yet." "When?" "When it becomes relevant." She looked up and met those silver eyes with a calm that 11 years of surviving impossible situations had carved directly into her nervous system. "And I suspect it will." The negotiation sessions ran 6 hours a day, which Ren suspected was a Velthari test disguised as a schedule. She'd read the briefing files on their diplomatic customs during the 3-week transit to Velthara Station. Velthari negotiations were structured around endurance, as much as argument. Their culture viewed the capacity to remain composed under prolonged pressure as a direct indicator of whether an entity could be trusted with serious commitments. You didn't just negotiate with them, you demonstrated over many hours and many days that you were the kind of person who didn't crack under sustained strain. The agreement you eventually reached was almost secondary to the proof of character the process was designed to extract. Earth Coalition had sent her for exactly this reason. Ren didn't crack. It wasn't stubbornness exactly, or the particular brand of competitive pride that made some diplomats treat endurance like a performance sport. It was something quieter than that, a deep, almost cellular familiarity with discomfort that had stopped registering as a problem years ago. When you had spent significant portions of your career in environments that actively wanted to kill you, 6 hours of structured conversation in a temperature-controlled room felt, honestly, like a rest day. She took her position at the central table on the second morning and pulled up her data display, while the Velthari delegation arranged themselves across from her with the unhurried precision of people who had done this thousands of times. Sova took the center seat directly opposite, her silver gaze finding Ren immediately with that quality of focused attention she'd shown the day before. The ear fans along her jaw were in what Ren was beginning to recognize as a neutral, alert position. Engaged, assessing, not yet committed to any particular emotional direction. "You reviewed our preliminary territorial proposals overnight," Sova said. It wasn't a question. "3 times, Ren confirmed. "I also cross-referenced them against the geological surveys from the Kerath Expanse that your science division filed with the Coalition 18 months ago, the resource extraction projections your economic ministry submitted last quarter, and the population distribution models from your last census." A brief pause traveled through the Velthari delegation like a small, contained wave. Several ear fans shifted. Sova's expression didn't change, but something behind her silver eyes moved. A recalibration, quiet and precise. Those population models were not included in the materials provided to your delegation, Sova said. No, Ren agreed pleasantly. They were publicly filed. I found them. The silence that followed had a different texture than the laughter of the first day. This was the silence of a room full of very intelligent people quietly revising their assumptions about who they were sitting across from. Ren had learned to recognize it. She didn't let herself enjoy it, because enjoying it led to performing it, and performance was where diplomats started making mistakes. The proposals are not unreasonable on their surface, she continued, pulling up the territorial map so it hung in the air between them. The Kirath expanse rendered in soft blue light, boundaries marked in amber. The demarcation lines your council suggests would give Velthara access to approximately 60% of the subsurface mineral deposits and full navigation rights through the 3 primary transit corridors. I understand the logic. But, Sova said, the proposals were written for the Kirath expanse as it existed 8 years ago, when those surveys were first commissioned. Ren adjusted the display, overlaying more recent data, smaller markers, different distribution patterns. The subsurface deposits have shifted. There are 2 significant seismic fault networks that your survey didn't capture because the technology for detecting that particular geological formation didn't exist yet when the original work was done. Your 60% of the mineral rights, as currently demarcated, covers mostly empty rock. The actual deposits are here. She highlighted 3 clusters, 2 of which fell outside the proposed Velthari boundary entirely. Silence again. Longer this time. Sova leaned forward very slightly, studying the overlay. Her ear fans had moved into a new configuration, fully forward, which Ren had observed meant something closer to alert concentration than anything else. You're telling us our own proposal works against our interests. I'm telling you the proposal was built on incomplete information, which is nobody's fault. The geology changed, the data didn't. Ren met her eyes. I'm not here to take advantage of that gap. I'm here to build something that functions, which means both sides need to understand what they're actually negotiating over. You could have said nothing, said one of the other delegates, older with elaborate patterns worked into the crest structure above his ear fans, which Ren's briefing files indicated denoted seniority in the council hierarchy. His voice carried a note she was beginning to associate with Velthari skepticism. If our proposal gives you the better geological position, your silence would have served your coalition's interests. Short term, Ren said. Long term, we'd have an agreement built on bad data. The first resource extraction operation would reveal the discrepancy. You'd feel deceived, even if we didn't deceive you intentionally. The agreement would collapse. We'd spend the next decade in dispute proceedings instead of building infrastructure. She paused. I've seen that version of this story play out. It's tedious and expensive, and both sides end up worse off than if they'd started with accurate maps. The senior delegate's ear fans shifted into an expression Ren didn't have a clean translation for yet. He exchanged a look with Sova, the quick, dense communication of colleagues who have worked together long enough to hold entire conversations in a glance. Sova looked back at Ren. You are a very unusual diplomat. I'm not really a diplomat, Ren said. I build things. This is just the part that has to happen before the building can start. And yet you navigate our processes better than most trained negotiators we receive from coalition worlds. Ren almost said something deflecting. She caught it. I pay attention, she said instead. Your processes aren't arbitrary. They're designed to find out if the person across the table can be trusted with something real. That seems worth respecting. Sova was quiet for a moment. Outside the delegation hall, through the breathing membrane walls, Ren could hear the distant ambient sounds of the station, the low, resonant hum of the power distribution system, the movement of air through circulation channels, the vast mechanical breathing of a structure that housed 60,000 beings. We will need to commission updated surveys, Sova said finally. The proposals will require significant revision. I can have coalition geological teams ready to begin joint surveys within 2 weeks of authorization, Ren said. I've already drafted the technical protocols. They're designed to meet Velthari scientific standards, not just coalition ones. Another small wave of adjustment moved through the delegation. Ear fans, posture, the angle of silver eyes. You drafted survey protocols, Sova said slowly, before we had agreed there was a problem with the existing data. I drafted them on the transit here, Ren said. I thought there might be a problem with the existing data. Sova looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then one corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, not quite not a smile. Something in between, like the first degree of movement towards something larger. Your armor, she said quietly, almost to herself. Not a tease this time, something closer to reconsideration. Ren said nothing. She pulled up the survey protocol drafts and let them speak instead. The station had a common area on the 14th level that nobody had officially designated as a gathering place for off-duty personnel, but which had become one anyway through the slow, organic logic of people needing somewhere to exist that wasn't a workspace. Ren found it on her 4th evening, following the sound of low conversation and something that smelled remarkably close to coffee, without actually being coffee. The space was carved into the outer hull, one full wall replaced by a transparent membrane that looked out onto open space, the Kerath expanse visible in the middle distance, a sprawling belt of rock and mineral deposits, and old light that both species were here to argue over. From 14 stories up, floating in the dark between stars, it looked nothing like something worth arguing over. It looked like something worth simply watching. She got a cup of the not coffee from an automated station near the entrance. It tasted like cardamom and something faintly metallic, and was surprisingly good, and found a seat near the viewing membrane where she could decompress without having to talk to anyone. She had been sitting for approximately 7 minutes when Sova sat down across from her. Not the senior delegate, formal and measured, leading the Velthari position from the center chair, just Sova, in what appeared to be off-duty clothing, simpler lines, the elaborate ceremonial layering of the delegation hall replaced by something that moved more naturally with her. Her ear fans were in a relaxed position Ren hadn't seen during any of the formal sessions. It changed her face considerably, made her look younger, made her look like a person rather than a representative of an institutional position. You don't mind, Sova said. It landed somewhere between a question and a statement. I don't mind, Ren confirmed. They sat in silence for a moment, both looking out at the expanse. The not coffee steamed gently between Ren's hands. The light from distant stars came through the membrane in colors that had traveled incomprehensible distances to arrive here and illuminate 2 beings drinking hot beverages in companionable quiet. You know, Sova said eventually, my colleague spent considerable time this evening discussing you. Unfavorably, I hope. I find I do my best work when people underestimate me. Something shifted in Sova's expression, that almost smile again, more visible now without the formal context demanding she suppress it. Mixed, Elder Krath believes you are running a long manipulation, that the geological data correction was a trust-building tactic designed to make us lower our guard before a more significant strategic move. And you? Sova considered the question with the same quality of careful attention she brought to everything. I think Elder Krath has been a diplomat for so long that he has forgotten that some people simply mean what they say. Ren looked at her. That's a generous interpretation. It is an accurate one, I believe, though I reserve the right to revise it. The ear fans tilted slightly. What I find more interesting than your intentions is your preparation. You arrived knowing things about our geological surveys that our own delegation hadn't cross-referenced. You had protocols drafted before we acknowledged needing them. You've reviewed cultural materials on Velthari negotiation customs that most coalition diplomats never bother with. A pause. You prepared for this as though it genuinely mattered to you, not as a career milestone, as a thing worth doing well. Ren thought about how to answer that. Outside, a slow-moving survey drone caught the light briefly before disappearing back into the dark. The lower districts of my home city had a water problem when I was young, she said. Not here, not relevant to anything we're negotiating, but you asked about preparation, so I'm going to answer from the actual beginning. She paused. The infrastructure was old. The population had grown past what it was designed for. The fixes were always temporary because the people making decisions were focused on what was politically manageable, not what would actually solve the problem. So nothing ever really got solved. It just got patched until the next failure. Sova was listening with full attention, ear fans forward. I became an engineer because I wanted to build things that didn't fail people, Ren continued. The military component came later. There were places that needed infrastructure rebuilt after conflict, and the only way to get there was in uniform. The diplomatic work came even later, and honestly it still feels like a borrowed coat most of the time. She looked at the expanse. But the preparation, that's just engineering habit. You don't build something important without understanding the ground it's sitting on first. You see this negotiation as a foundation, Sova said. Every agreement is a foundation for whatever gets built on top of it. If the foundation is wrong, everything above it eventually falls. Ren glanced at her. Your 7-centimeter living stone armor. Is it actually 7 centimeters? The shift in topic registered on Sova's face as mild surprise, then amusement. Standard combat plate, yes. Grown over approximately 3 years from mineral-bonded organisms that calcify progressively. By full maturity, it will stop most projectile weapons, significant energy discharge, and direct blade contact from anything short of military-grade cutting equipment. How much does it weigh? A full set? Approximately 90 kilograms. Ren nodded slowly. And your warriors train under that weight from what age? Integration training begins around physical maturity, 14 to 16 cycles, depending on individual development. The body adapts over years. Eventually, the weight becomes natural. Sova tilted her head. You're doing something with this line of questioning. Just understanding the ground, Ren said. Your armor philosophy and mine come from completely different starting points. Yours is built on the assumption that the warrior adapts to the protection. Mine is built on the assumption that the protection adapts to the warrior. And you believe your approach superior? I believe my approach is appropriate for my species, Ren said. Whether it's superior depends entirely on what problem you're trying to solve. She turned the not coffee cup in her hands. Your plate armor is extraordinary for sustained ground engagement against opponents with similar capabilities. It's a statement as much as protection. It says, I am immovable, I am permanent, I endure. That's a genuine advantage in warfare that rewards presence and endurance. But, Sova said again. Ren smiled slightly. But humans aren't immovable. We never were. We're fast, we're adaptable, and historically speaking, we've survived by being harder to kill than anything that tried to kill us. Not because we were the strongest thing in any given environment, but because we were the most stubbornly persistent. She looked at the expanse. My suit doesn't stop everything. It's not meant to. It's meant to keep me functional long enough to adapt to whatever is trying to stop me. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than awkward. Sova looked at her with that recalibrating expression Ren was getting better at reading, the particular quality of a highly capable mind updating its model of something it thought it had already understood. You said the first day that you would answer the armor question when it became relevant, Sova said quietly. I did. Is it relevant now? Ren considered the expanse outside, all that distance and rock and frozen light, waiting for 2 species to decide what to build across it. Getting there, she said. Sova's ear fans shifted into an expression Ren was now reasonably confident meant something close to genuine interest, the kind that had moved past professional assessment into something more personal and less easily categorized. She didn't name it. She just registered it, filed it carefully, and looked back at the stars. The not coffee had gone slightly cool. It was still good. The Joint Geological Survey authorization came through on day 8, which Ren had privately estimated would take 12, so she revised her opinion of Velthari administrative efficiency upward by a meaningful margin. The survey teams assembled in the station's lower docking level, 4 coalition geologists in standard-issue field gear, looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the operation, and 6 Velthari survey specialists whose equipment was, characteristically, partially alive. Their ground-penetrating instruments were grown rather than manufactured, long, crystalline structures that hummed at frequencies Ren could feel in her back teeth rather than hear with her ears. The coalition geologists kept glancing at the Velthari equipment with the specific expression of scientists encountering something that violated their foundational assumptions about how tools worked. Ren stood between both teams and felt entirely at home. "The survey grid is divided into 9 sectors," she said, pulling up the operational map on a shared display that both species' systems could read simultaneously. A small technical achievement that had taken her 2 days of advanced preparation to arrange, and which nobody had commented on, which was fine. Acknowledgement wasn't the point. Function was. Coalition teams take sectors 1 through 4, Velthari teams take 5 through 9. Overlap zone in the center gets joint coverage. All raw data goes into the shared archive simultaneously. No processing lag, no filtered releases. Both delegations see everything at the same time. Elder Krath, who had accompanied the delegation to observe the survey launch, made a sound that Ren had catalogued as politely expressed skepticism. Simultaneous data sharing is irregular protocol. Standard practice involves independent analysis before joint review. Standard practice also produced the situation where we're renegotiating a proposal built on 8-year-old surveys, Ren said, keeping her tone even. Simultaneous sharing removes the possibility that either side feels the other had an information advantage. It builds the foundation of the agreement at the same time as it builds the data. She looked at him directly. If there's a specific security concern driving the preference for independent analysis, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Otherwise, I'd like to proceed. The pause that followed was the kind that contained a significant amount of internal Velthari communication, happening in the subtle language of ear fan positions and minute postural adjustments. Ren waited without filling the silence, which she had learned was itself a form of communication their culture respected. Elder Krath's ear fans settled. Proceed. The survey teams deployed, and Ren spent the next 6 hours managing the operational coordination with the focused, systematic attention she brought to any logistical problem. Tracking data streams, resolving the 3 minor equipment compatibility issues that emerged in the first hour, mediating a brief but intense disagreement between one of her geologists and a Velthari specialist about subsurface mapping methodology that threatened to derail Sector 7's timeline entirely. She resolved that last one by asking both parties to explain their methodology to her as though she knew nothing, which she definitely did not claim to be true, and then identifying the 2 points of actual disagreement buried under 6 layers of professional terminology and wounded scientific pride. The actual disagreement was minor. She suggested a hybrid approach. Both specialists independently decided this was their own idea, and Sector 7 resumed on schedule. Sova appeared at her shoulder approximately 20 minutes after the Sector 7 resolution, having observed the last portion of it from a discreet distance. "You enjoy this," Sova said quietly. Not an accusation, more like someone identifying a species of bird they hadn't expected to find in this particular location. "The problem-solving part," Ren confirmed. "The part where there's a real thing that isn't working, and you find the actual reason it isn't working, and fix the actual reason, instead of just treating the symptoms. Yes, I enjoy that. Most people find logistics tedious. Most people are thinking about the logistics. I'm thinking about the thing the logistics are supposed to produce." Ren pulled up a data stream on her wrist display, checking Sector 3's progress. "If you're focused on what you're building, the construction details aren't tedious. They're just the path." Sova was quiet for a moment, watching the survey team's work. The crystalline Velthari instruments hummed their subsonic song through the rock layers below them, and the coalition equipment clicked and pinged in its more mechanical register. And together they made an accidental duet that was, Ren thought, not unpleasant. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the survey?" Sova said. "You can ask me anything. I reserve the right to answer with varying degrees of completeness. The ear fans tilted in that expression Ren had identified as amusement. Your service record. I reviewed it before the negotiations began. Standard background research, she added, with a slight quality in her voice that might have been mild self-consciousness. You've been deployed to 11 conflict or post-conflict zones over your career. 4 of those deployments have classified incident reports attached to them. Ren kept her eyes on the data stream. That's accurate. The classified designations prevent me from seeing the details, but the contextual data around them is visible. Duration of engagement, resource consumption, the gap between when a situation began and when it was resolved. Sova paused. In each of those 4 incidents, you were the only coalition personnel present for significant portions of the timeline. Also accurate. That means extended periods alone in hostile environments. A careful quality had entered Sova's voice, not quite clinical, not quite personal, navigating somewhere between the two. Periods during which, by the resource logs, your suit systems were operating under significant stress. Ren set the data display down. She looked at the expanse beyond the survey site, at all that cold and dark and indifferent distance. She thought about 4 specific memories she kept in a part of her mind that had very good locks on it, and which she opened only when necessary. You're asking about the armor, she said. I'm asking about the cost, Sova said quietly. You said when I called it a toy that consequences and defeat were different things. I've been thinking about that distinction for 8 days. The survey teams moved in the middle distance, instruments singing their different songs into the rock. The shared data archive was filling with accurate information about the actual ground beneath their feet, information that would make the thing they eventually built more solid and more honest than it would have been otherwise. Ren owed this negotiation her honesty. She'd established that in the first hour of the first session. There was an infrastructure assessment on a moon called Perith 4, she said. Post-conflict zone. The conflict had officially ended, which meant in practice that the organized violence had stopped, and the disorganized violence was still working out its schedule. She kept her voice level, the way she always kept it when she discussed these things, not because she felt nothing, but because feeling everything simultaneously was not useful. I was there to assess whether the water reclamation systems were salvageable or needed full replacement. The team I was with got separated in the second week by an event that isn't relevant to your question. I finished the assessment alone. How long? 19 days. Sova's ear fans had gone very still. My suit kept me functional, Ren said. Not comfortable. Not safe exactly. Functional. Warm enough not to develop hypothermia. Oxygenated when the atmospheric processes in 2 of the sectors had failed. Structurally supported enough that when part of a reclamation facility collapsed on me in day 11, I could dig myself out instead of waiting for someone to do it for me. She finally looked at Sova directly. The suit took significant damage. I took significant damage. We were both operational at the end of 19 days, which is the only metric that mattered. The silence stretched between them, full and serious. The water reclamation systems, Sova said finally. Were they salvageable? Ren felt something shift slightly in her chest, the particular warmth of someone asking exactly the right question. 60% of them. The rest needed replacement. I filed a complete report with repair specifications and a phased reconstruction timeline. The systems were fully restored 14 months later. 2 million people, Sova said quietly. The population of that moon. 2,300,000, Ren confirmed, give or take. Sova looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. The ear fans had moved into an expression Ren didn't have a translation for yet. Something new, something her growing catalogue hadn't captured. It felt significant. She filed it carefully. Your armor, Sova said at last, her voice carrying something different than it had on the first day, is not a toy. No, Ren agreed simply. It's not. The data from the joint survey came back cleaner than Ren had projected, which meant the revised territorial proposals could be drafted faster than either delegation had officially anticipated. which meant the negotiation had entered the phase that experienced diplomats privately called the dangerous middle, the point where the practical work was largely done, and the political work, the harder and less tractable kind, moved to the center of the table. Elder Krath had opinions about the revised boundary demarcations, extensive, detailed, historically referenced opinions delivered in the measured cadence of someone who had been winning arguments through sheer, comprehensive preparation for longer than Ren had been alive. She respected it. She also spent 4 hours across 2 sessions methodically working through each point with the same systematic patience she applied to engineering problems, acknowledging what was valid, redirecting what wasn't, and building a counterposition so thoroughly documented that even Elder Krath's formidable argumentative infrastructure kept finding solid ground where it expected soft spots. On the 3rd day of boundary negotiations, Elder Krath made a point about historical Velthari navigation rights through the central corridor that was genuinely strong, better than anything he'd produced previously, drawing on treaty precedents from 3 separate prior agreements that Ren hadn't weighted heavily enough in her preparation. She told him so directly. The silence that followed had a quality she hadn't encountered before in the delegation hall. Elder Krath's ear fans moved through several positions in rapid succession. Sova, seated to his left, went very still in the particular way Ren had learned meant she was controlling a visible reaction. "You are conceding the point," Elder Krath said slowly. "I'm acknowledging that your precedent citations are stronger than my counterposition on that specific element," Ren said. "That's not the same as conceding the boundary line, because the historical navigation rights and the current resource demarcation are separate questions. But you're right that I underweighted those treaties, and I'd rather say so now than have it become a vulnerability in the final agreement." Elder Krath looked at her for a long moment. The ear fans settled into an expression that Ren, after 2 weeks of careful study, was fairly confident indicated something she had not expected from him. Genuine reassessment. "I have negotiated with coalition representatives for 30 years, he said. "I have never had one tell me my argument was stronger than theirs." "Did none of them think so? Or did none of them say so?" A pause. "Both, in most cases. That explains some things about the quality of your prior agreements," Ren said, not unkindly. Something happened in Elder Krath's expression that might, under very specific lighting conditions, have been the beginning of a smile. He covered it efficiently. His ear fans returned to their professional neutral position. "We will recess for the day and return tomorrow with revised proposals on the central corridor provisions." The session ended with an unusual quality in the room, something lighter than the formal weight that had characterized most of the preceding 2 weeks. Several of the junior Velthari delegates were doing the ear fan equivalent of keeping very straight faces, which Ren had learned meant they were suppressing amusement. She gathered her materials without comment and let it stand. Sova caught up with her in the corridor outside. Not the deliberate, purposeful interception of official business, the kind of catching up that happened when someone had been moving in the same direction as you anyway, and simply allowed the proximity to become conversation. Ren had been noticing the distinction between these 2 types of encounters for about a week now, and filing the observations alongside everything else she was carefully not drawing conclusions from. "Elder Krath is going to revise his opinion of you upward tonight," Sova said, matching her stride. "He should revise his proposals upward. His opinion of me is less relevant. He's been senior voice on 14 major territorial negotiations. His opinion of you will affect every future coalition interaction with the Accord Council for the next decade at minimum." Sova glanced at her sideways. "His opinion of you is quite relevant." "Fine. His opinion of me and his proposals, both upward." Ren paused at a junction in the corridor, checking her internal map of the station's layout. "I'm going to the engineering level. I want to look at the station's power distribution architecture before the evening session data review." Sova stopped. "The power distribution architecture. I keep feeling that hum through the floor in the delegation hall. I want to understand what's producing it." Ren looked at her. "Is that a strange thing to want to do?" "It is an unusual way to spend a recess afternoon. I find it difficult to be in a structure I don't understand." She considered. "It's not anxiety exactly, more like Incomplete information registers as a low-level distraction. If I understand what the building is doing, I can stop allocating attention to it and use that attention for something more productive. Sova was quiet for a moment. I would like to come. Ren looked at her. The words had been delivered with Sova's characteristic composure, but there was something underneath them, a directness that wasn't quite in keeping with the careful diplomatic register she maintained in formal settings, like something said because it was true, rather than because it was strategically optimal. Then come, Ren said simply. The engineering level was 3 floors below the delegation spaces, accessible through a service corridor that clearly did not receive many visiting dignitaries. The walls were less refined here, the organic architecture giving way to more visible structural elements, the bones of the station showing through its skin. Ren found it considerably more interesting than the polished surfaces above. The power distribution system was extraordinary. She stood in front of the main junction array for a full 2 minutes without speaking, just looking. It was a hybrid system, like most Velthari engineering, partially mechanical, partially organic. The 2 components so thoroughly integrated that the boundary between them was impossible to identify cleanly. Living conduits pulsed alongside manufactured channels, distributing energy through the station in rhythmic waves that were, she now understood, the hum she felt through the floor. The system breathed. It literally breathed, the organic components expanding and contracting in a cycle timed to the station's energy demand fluctuations. "It's beautiful," she said, which was not what she had planned to say. She had planned to say something technical about the efficiency of the distribution methodology. Sova stood beside her, close enough that Ren was acutely aware of the proximity in a way that had nothing to do with engineering. Most visitors don't see it that way. They're not looking at what it's doing, they're looking at what it looks like. Ren studied the junction array. This is solving a problem that human engineering handles with brute force redundancy. We build 3 backup systems for every primary system and hope the failures don't cascade. It adapts in real time. It redistributes load before failures occur because the organic components sense stress before it becomes structural. She shook her head slightly. We've been doing it wrong. You couldn't replicate this. The organic components require decades of cultivation. I know, but the principle, she gestured at the breathing array, the principle of a system that senses and adapts rather than just absorbs and endures. That's something we could learn from. She paused. That's something I could learn from. She became aware that Sova was not looking at the power distribution array. When Ren turned, Sova was watching her with an expression she had no entry for in her catalogue. Something that had moved entirely outside the range of what she'd been systematically documenting. It was open in a way the delegation hall never allowed. It was the expression of someone who had stopped calculating. What? Ren said. You do that, Sova said quietly. You look at something built by my people, and you find what's worth learning from it. Not what's inferior to your own methods, not what you would do differently. A pause. You look for what's worth learning. That's just good engineering practice. It is not how most coalition representatives approach our technology. Sova's voice was careful, carrying something underneath it. It is not how most beings approach things that are different from what they know. Ren looked at her directly. In the hum and pulse of the breathing array, with the bones of the station visible around them, all the formal architecture of the delegation hall felt very far away. You mentioned when we first spoke that impossible was just another word for difficult, Sova said. You remembered that. I remember most things you say. The ear fans were in that new configuration again, the one she'd first seen at the survey site, the one without a translation in her catalogue. I find I pay attention to it more than is strictly required by my professional responsibilities. The hum of the array filled the silence between them, regular and warm, a structure built to sense and adapt rather than simply endure. Sova, Ren said. Yes. I'm going to finish reviewing these implementation proposals tonight. Of course. And tomorrow I'm going to negotiate the central corridor provisions with Elder Krath until we have language both delegations can sign. I expect nothing less. And after that, Ren said, I'd like to have a conversation that has nothing to do with territorial boundaries or resource rights or geological surveys. The ear fans shifted into the expression Ren finally had a translation for. She'd found it 3 days ago, buried in a cultural reference document she'd requested from the station's archive. An expression so specific that her briefing files hadn't included it because it wasn't considered relevant to diplomatic contexts. It meant I was hoping you would say that. After that, Sova said, I would like that very much. The central corridor provisions took 2 days instead of 1, which Ren had privately considered the more likely outcome and had planned for accordingly. Elder Krath arrived on the first morning with revised proposals that were genuinely better than his previous position. Tighter historical citations, more sophisticated arguments about navigation precedent, a proposed compromise on the resource extraction boundary that showed he had spent the recess thinking carefully rather than simply reinforcing his existing position. Ren had spent the recess doing the same thing. The result was a negotiation that felt less like a contest and more like two people jointly solving a problem from opposite sides, occasionally surprising each other with the quality of their thinking, occasionally conceding ground because the other person had simply found better footing. By the end of the second afternoon, they had language that worked. Not perfect language. No territorial agreement ever had perfect language, because perfect language required both sides to want exactly the same things, which they never did. But honest language, precise language, the kind that named what it meant and meant what it named, leaving minimal space for the creative reinterpretation that caused agreements to collapse 3 years after signing. When the final provision was drafted, and both delegations had reviewed it in silence for the 15 minutes that Velthari protocol required before verbal acknowledgement, Elder Krath looked across the table at Ren with an expression she had not seen on his face before. I will be recommending this agreement to the full Accord Council, he said, and I will be recommending that future coalition negotiations be conducted by personnel with your particular approach to the process. I'll pass that along, Ren said, though I should mention that I'm not entirely typical of coalition diplomatic personnel. I had gathered that impression. The ear fans moved. Ren was now nearly certain that specific configuration was the Velthari equivalent of dry humor. The recommendation stands. The session closed with the particular quality of ending that came from having actually finished something, not the provisional conclusion of a recess or a procedural pause, but the real completion of a stage of work. People gathered their materials with a different energy than usual, lighter and more direct. Several of the junior delegates who had spent 2 weeks maintaining careful diplomatic neutrality were now exchanging what were clearly personal comments in rapid Velthari that Ren's translation system couldn't quite keep pace with. She was packing her own materials when Sova appeared at her side, with the same quality of casual proximity she'd demonstrated outside the corridor 11 days ago, the kind that had stopped pretending to be accidental. Dinner, Sova said. Not in the delegation dining hall. Where? The station has a botanical level, level 22. It was built for atmospheric processing, but has evolved into something considerably more pleasant over the years. A pause. It is not a formal setting. I don't own anything informal, Ren said. Everything I packed is either field gear or professional attire. Your field gear will be sufficient. The ear fans tilted. It's not as though I haven't seen it before. Level 22 was not what Ren had expected, which was increasingly becoming her standard experience of Velthara Station. She had expected something functional with aesthetic aspirations, the kind of space that announced its attempt at beauty more than it achieved it. What she found instead was a genuine ecosystem, suspended 60 meters above the station's residential levels, a contained biosphere of growing things from multiple worlds, coexisting in careful balance. The atmospheric processes so thoroughly integrated with the plant life that the boundary between mechanical system and living system had dissolved entirely. It smelled extraordinary, green and complex and alive, in a way that no space station had any right to smell. Your people built this, Ren said, standing at the entrance and taking it in. Over 40 years. It began as a practical necessity and became something else. Sova moved into the space with the ease of someone who had been here many times. I come here when the delegation work becomes, she paused, choosing her word carefully, accumulated. When you need somewhere to be that isn't a role. Sova glanced at her. Yes, exactly that. They found a space near the far edge where the growing things thinned enough to see through a transparent panel to the stars beyond, the Kerath expanse visible again, as it was from almost everywhere on the station, a constant presence that had stopped feeling contested and started feeling simply like the view. Food had been arranged by some advanced mechanism Ren hadn't observed being set in motion, a selection of Velthari dishes she recognized from the delegation meals, alongside several items she didn't, plated with the Velthari aesthetic instinct for making functional things beautiful. They ate without the mediation of formal protocol, which changed the texture of conversation entirely. Sova asked about Earth with the curiosity of someone who had read materials but wanted the version that existed beneath documentation, what it actually felt like to live in a gravity well, what the sky looked like in the city where Ren had grown up, whether human food tasted as strange to humans as it did to everyone else. Ren answered honestly and asked equivalent questions in return, and discovered that Sova had grown up in a coastal city on Velthara's second continent, where the ocean was purple due to a particular mineral content in the water, and that she had wanted to be a marine researcher before the political circumstances of her family had redirected her toward diplomatic training at 16, and that she still sometimes felt the loss of that alternate path in the particular way of things set down before you were old enough to understand you were setting them down. Do you regret it? Ren asked. Sova considered the question with her characteristic care. I regret the loss of that specific thing. I don't regret where I am. They are separate griefs, and I've learned to hold them separately. She looked at Ren. Do you regret the path that brought you here? The conflict zones, the classified incidents? No. Ren said it without hesitation, which was its own kind of answer. I've been afraid during those things. I've been injured. I've been in positions where the probability of a good outcome was not something I would have bet on. She looked at her hands, the small scars across her knuckles, the one across her left palm that had required 12 stitches in a field kit with no anesthetic. But every one of those situations produced something that mattered. Clean water, rebuilt infrastructure, systems that served people who needed them. The cost was real and the outcome was real, and I think they were proportional. A pause. Usually I think they were proportional. Usually. There are 2 of the 4 I review sometimes, whether the outcome justified what it cost. She said it quietly, not as a wound but as an honest accounting. I haven't reached a different conclusion yet, but I keep reviewing. Sova looked at her steadily. That is not a small thing, to keep asking the question even when you believe the answer. It would be easier not to. Most things worth doing are easier not to do. Sova's ear fans were in a position Ren had no formal translation for, but had been privately cataloguing under a working label she hadn't yet committed to naming out loud. That is something I have been thinking about recently, with some frequency. The botanical level breathed around them, its 40 years of accumulated living systems processing the air into something that tasted like intention. Through the transparent panel, the Kerath expanse held its ancient position in the dark, patient and enormous, and indifferent to the small, warm things deciding what to build across it. Sova, Ren said. Yes. The conversation I said I wanted to have, after the corridor provisions were settled. I remember. I want to be precise because I think precision matters with you, and I don't want to leave room for misinterpretation. Ren looked at her directly, with the same quality of calm she brought to difficult things. Not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling obscure clarity. I have been paying more attention to you than my professional responsibilities require for approximately 10 days. I have been aware of that fact, and I have been aware that it was probably mutual, and I have been avoiding naming it because naming it creates a situation with significant complications. Sova's ear fans were perfectly still. The complications are real, Ren continued. Different species, different worlds, a professional context that doesn't accommodate personal entanglement cleanly, and the fact that I will eventually leave this station and return to Coalition space. Those are not small things, she paused. But I have spent my career building structures in difficult ground. I have learned that difficult ground is not the same as impossible ground, and I thought you should know that I know the difference. The silence stretched. Outside, a survey drone caught starlight and released it. Sova reached across the space between them and placed her hand over Ren's. The touch deliberate and unhurried, the way Velthari physical contact always was, nothing accidental about it. The armor question, she said softly. Ren waited. I understand now why you wore it. I understand what it has cost you, and what it has made possible. Her thumb moved slightly against the back of Ren's hand, tracing the edge of the scar across her knuckles. I would like to know the person who wears it. Not the diplomat, not the engineer. The person underneath those things, who reviews 2 decisions she believes were right and still asks the question. The botanical level breathed. The stars held their positions. That person, Ren said quietly, is significantly less composed than the diplomat. Good, Sova said. I find I have seen enough composure to last several lifetimes. Ren turned her hand over and let her fingers close around Sova's, the scars and all, the cost and all, the complicated ground and all. Outside, the Kerath expanse waited to be built across, enormous and patient, full of accurate data and honest foundations. Inside, 2 people sat in a garden that had grown from necessity into something more, and let the distance between them become something smaller than it had been before. The formal signing of the Kerath Expanse Territorial Accord took place on the station's ceremonial level, a space Ren had not previously visited because ceremonial levels were not typically relevant to her work until the work was finished. It was, characteristically for Velthari design, extraordinary. The ceiling opened to a direct view of space through a transparent dome, so optically perfect it felt like standing in the open void, the stars and the distant mineral belt of the expanse hanging above the assembled dignitaries like the most honest possible witness to what was being committed to. The floor was grown from the same living stone as the armor Sova had described weeks ago, warm and faintly resonant underfoot. The walls held historical records embedded directly into their structure, not displayed on screens but grown into the material itself. The station's 40-year history made physically present in the room where its next chapter was being written. Ren stood at the signing table in her dress uniform, which was slightly more formal than her field gear and slightly less formal than what every Velthari dignitary in the room was wearing, which she had decided to treat as a reasonable median position rather than a diplomatic failure. Beside her, the coalition's senior representative, Ambassador Delacroix, who had arrived 2 days ago from the regional hub specifically for the signing ceremony, was maintaining the expression of someone who had read a thorough briefing but was still finding the lived reality of Velthara Station somewhat larger than the documents had suggested. The geological overlay and the final boundary maps, Delacroix murmured to her as they waited for the ceremony to begin. That was your work? The survey methodology was collaborative. The decision to correct their proposal using their own data before they noticed the discrepancy themselves, that was yours. That was just accurate information sharing. Delacroix gave her the look of a senior diplomat who had been doing this long enough to recognize the difference between modesty and misdirection. The Council is calling this the most substantively sound territorial agreement we've reached in this sector in 20 years. Elder Krath apparently used the phrase structural integrity to describe the negotiation process in his report to the full Accord Council, which I'm told is the highest possible compliment he gives anything. Elder Krath is a rigorous thinker, Ren said. He deserves credit for revising his position when the evidence warranted it. That's harder than it sounds. Commander Vasquez, Ambassador, accept the acknowledgement. Ren accepted the acknowledgement. The ceremony proceeded with the elaborate precision of Velthari formal protocol, ritual language in the original Velthari with simultaneous translation, the presentation of the physical accord document, grown from station material rather than printed, which meant it would continue living after the signing, in the specific Velthari philosophical sense that important things should remain capable of growth and change. Ren had read about this tradition in her preparation materials and had found it considerably more moving in practice than in description. Elder Krath signed for the Accord Council with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of what he was committing to and had chosen to commit to it anyway. He looked at Ren once before signing, a brief direct look that carried an entire conversation compressed into a single moment of eye contact, acknowledgement, respect, and something that in a human face she would have called reluctant affection. She gave him a small nod. He signed. Ambassador Delacroix signed for the coalition. The room held its collective breath for the 3 seconds between signatures, the way rooms always did at the moment when possibility became fact. Then it was done. The applause from the assembled observers was not the polite acknowledgement of a concluded procedure. It was the genuine release of 2 weeks of sustained collective tension, the sound of people who had been waiting to find out if this was going to work discovering that it had. Ren stood very still in the middle of it, and felt something she recognized from the completion of engineering projects. The particular satisfaction of a thing built correctly, the quiet knowledge that whatever came next, this foundation would hold. Across the room, Sova met her eyes. Not the senior voice of the Accord Council measuring the coalition representative, just Sova, in the enormous, starred room, with an expression that had no diplomatic function whatsoever. Ren held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than professional protocol required. The reception that followed was the kind of event that existed to let the formal conclusion breathe into something more human, or in this case, more humanly equivalent across 2 species. Food and conversation circulated in equal measure. Junior delegates who had spent 2 weeks maintaining careful neutrality were now exchanging contact information and discussing collaborative research possibilities. One of Ren's coalition geologists had found a Velthari counterpart, whose methodology disagreement in Sector 7 had apparently transformed over the course of the survey into the foundation of a research partnership they were now animatedly planning across the language barrier. Elder Krath found her near the edge of the reception, holding a glass of something ceremonial that tasted like mineral water filtered through ambition. The implementation phase, he said without preamble, which she had come to understand was his version of warmth. You'll be overseeing the coalition side. That's the plan. Good. He looked at his own glass. I want to tell you something that I would not say in a formal session, because formal sessions are not the appropriate place for it. Ren waited. I have spent 30 years believing that coalition representatives came to these negotiations to extract what they could from us, while giving as little as possible in return. That belief was not without basis in experience. He paused. You have given me reason to update that belief. Not abandon it entirely. I am not naive. But update it. The ear fans moved in that dry configuration. One data point does not make a pattern, but it is a beginning. That's all any foundation is, Ren said. A beginning that holds. Elder Krath made a sound she had never heard from him before, brief, low, unmistakably a laugh. He inclined his head with the formality of someone who had spent decades using formality as a precise instrument, turned, and rejoined the reception. Sova appeared at her shoulder 30 seconds later. What did he say to you? She said. His ear position when he walked away suggested something unprecedented had occurred. He told me I'd given him a reason to update a 30-year belief. Sova was quiet for a moment. Do you understand what that means from him? I'm starting to. They stood together at the edge of the reception while the room moved around them, 2 species finding the beginning of something new in the space between what they'd each assumed and what had turned out to be true. The dome above them held the stars without comment, indifferent and clear, the Kerath expanse present as always in the middle distance. The implementation phase begins in 6 weeks, Sova said. The first joint construction teams will need operational coordination from both delegations for the full 18-month timeline. That's a significant commitment of time, Ren said carefully. It is. Sova kept her eyes on the expanse. The senior Velthari coordination role will require someone who understands both the geological survey data and the organic-mechanical hybrid construction methodology, someone who was involved in the negotiation process from the beginning. A pause. I have already submitted my name to the council for that role. Ren absorbed this information. 18 months is a long implementation timeline, she said. Longer if complications arise, which they frequently do with construction of this scale. Sova finally looked at her, directly and without the mediation of diplomatic register. I find I am not especially concerned about complications. Neither am I, Ren said. I build in difficult ground. I know. Sova's ear fans moved into that expression, the one that had taken Ren 11 days to find a translation for, the one that meant, I was hoping you would say that. You have been telling me that since the first hour. Outside the dome, the Kerath expanse waited with its accurate data and its honest geology, and its 18 months of construction ahead. All that cold and dark and distance, patiently waiting to become infrastructure, to become something that served the people on both sides of it, to become a foundation that held. Inside, two people stood at the edge of a reception and let the complicated ground between them become exactly what it had always been. Not an obstacle, but the place where something worth building was waiting to begin. Ren thought about 11 years of difficult deployments, 4 classified incidents, 19 days alone on Perith 4, all the ground she had assessed and built across and surveyed honestly, even when the data was inconvenient. She thought about what Sova had said in the botanical level. I find I have seen enough composure to last several lifetimes, and felt something in her chest release the last of the careful, professional tension she'd been carrying since the first morning she walked into the delegation hall and heard laughter. The armor, she said quietly. Sova looked at her. You asked early on about the cost of survival, what it meant to come through things intact. Ren looked at her own reflection briefly in the ceremonial glass. The dress uniform, the scars at the edge of her collar, the expression of someone who had learned to build in hard places. I want you to know that this, whatever this is becoming, doesn't feel like survival. It feels like the thing survival was for. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, the way foundations are full, with weight that holds rather than burdens, with the particular solidity of something true. Sova reached out and touched the back of Ren's hand, brief and deliberate, in the public space of the reception where junior delegates and senior ambassadors and the entire carefully observed social architecture of two civilizations could see it if they looked. She looked. It was a choice. Then we build something worthy of it, Sova said. Above them, through the perfect dome, the stars held their ancient positions, indifferent to the small, warm things below them, but present as they had always been, burning at their impossible distances, crossing the dark to arrive here as light. Sometimes the most important thing a structure does is simply hold long enough for something else to grow. Sometimes the armor that looks like a toy is the thing that brings you home. Sometimes the cost of survival is exactly and precisely worth it. Not because the difficult things weren't difficult, but because on the other side of them, in a station that breathed and a garden built from necessity and a room full of stars, there is someone standing close enough to touch who looked at what you survived and saw not damage, but proof. Proof that you endure, proof that you build, proof that the ground, however hard, was never going to stop you from laying a foundation that holds. If this story stayed with you, there are thousands of people out there who would love it too. The share button costs you nothing and means everything to a small channel trying to reach the humans who need exactly this kind of story. HFY Soundscape lives and grows one listener at a time, and if you want to be here when the next one drops, the subscribe button is right there waiting. We'll see you in the next world.